we have Jared Bramblett of the Mean High Water Project talking about his photography and his work on flooding on the peninsula. Let's hear for Jared.
Thank you. Good evening. Happy to be here tonight and talk about my Mean High Water Project. I'm a civil engineer and photographer that's been in the Charleston area for about 15 years now. And as a civil engineer, I work a lot with stormwater management and flood mitigation projects. And over the past 5 or 6 years that we started to experience the impacts of sea level rise and climate change, I've really become passionate about looking at infrastructure solutions, both green and gray infrastructure solutions, to help us deal with the water that's here and, more importantly, the water that's coming. In 2015, as a photographer, I started documenting the flooding in Charleston. And it was ironic. I think some of the first photos I took were an 8-foot king tide flood event in September, I believe, 29th of 2015, which happened to be 3 days before what's now known as the 1,000-year storm. That's when we had, at the time, the 9th and 12th highest tides on record in Charleston Harbor, coupled with between 15 and 24 inches of rain over a couple-day period that resulted in pretty widespread, significant flooding across not only the city of Charleston, but all the way to pretty devastating impacts as far inland as Columbia. In 2020, I launched the Mean High Water Project, and the title's inspired by the tidal datum here in Charleston Harbor and one of the benchmarks. And I launched it with really 4 goals in mind that I wanted to talk about tonight. The first being documenting the impacts that we're seeing from flooding, but backing it up with the data, giving context to not just the imagery, but why we're seeing it. And as an engineer and working in stormwater management for the past 15 years, I've heard many times Charleston's always flooded. And that's very true. Charleston has struggled to manage its stormwater for a very long time. But it's changing. And a lot of the change is with the tides. The National Weather Service defines tidal flooding in Charleston Harbor as 7 to 7.5 feet above mean lower low water is minor, 7.5 to 8 is moderate, and above 8 is major. But what is mean lower low water? In Charleston, we see approximately 2 high tides and 2 low tides every day. And mean lower low water is simply the average of the lower of those 2 tides we see on the daily cycle. So significant tidal flooding, major tidal flooding occurs when tides get 8 feet above that average of that lower of the 2 tides. This graph you see here is the number of tidal floods we've seen in Charleston Harbor, those floods that get above 7 feet over the period of record, which is 1921 to today, so roughly a century. You can see the trend and how it's increasing. In 2009, I believe we set a record with 36 tidal floods, which we blew out of the water in 2015 with 58, which we proceeded to blow out of the water again with 89 in 2019. Luckily, the past 2 years, we've seen a downturn. This year, we've seen 38, actually 39, if you count today's tide that exceeded the 7-foot threshold. But you can still see it's a market trend up. Thankfully, the last 2 years haven't extended that trend that we saw in 2019, but it's still scary. But if you dig deeper into the data, it gets almost a little scarier. Over the century of record, we've had 40 tides that exceeded the 8-foot threshold in Charleston Harbor. 26 of them, or 65%, have occurred since 2015. 4 of them occurred in the past week. 10% of the major tidal floods we've seen in Charleston Harbor occurred this past weekend. The tides are changing, our flood risk is changing, and we need to change our response in dealing with it. One more dive into that data, and these are, again, all of those 8-foot tides that we've seen, all 40 of them. Between 1921 and 2015, we had 14. We've seen 26 since 2015. Again, 4 in the past week. My second goal of the Mean High Water Project is to break down the data, to break past. As an engineer, I'm really guilty of speaking in terms that I'm comfortable with acronyms and things that aren't easily understood by a lot of people that don't deal with it on a daily basis. And I wanted to provide a resource and a way for people to understand the risk we're facing in ways that maybe we don't do a good job of communicating otherwise. This is an animation I created showing the potential impacts of up to 5 feet of sea level rise. It's one of the first things I published in Mean High Water. And you can look at this data and any of the sea level rise viewers that are out there, but I wanted to strip it down so that the impacts and the vulnerabilities really jump out. These are USGS quad maps that you can get online, and I've georeferenced them and used elevation data from Charleston and Berkeley County to show those potential impacts. And by removing the color and only showing the blue of the potential tides, you can really see where we're most vulnerable and what areas are at risk as we look at sea level rise. Another map that I just recently created and published on the website is this elevations on mean low or low water. In Charleston, most of our elevation data, our FEMA maps, our topography maps, reference NAVD 88 datum. That's a survey grade datum, and there's a lot of reasons the maps reference those. But we reference our tide floods on mean low or low water, 7 foot, 7.5 foot, 8 feet. It's really difficult to understand if you're looking at elevation map what that means in real life on the peninsula. And so I've created this map with the hope of allowing, if you hear there's going to be an 8 foot tide or an 8.5 foot tide, you can look and pretty quickly see where those impacts are going to be and what areas are going to be vulnerable. Also here I've provided a quick datum conversion that allows you, if you need to convert from the FEMA data or from the NAVD 88 datum to mean high water or back, you can do that. If you have suggestions on this map, feel free to look at it. I'd love to improve this and make this a useful resource. My third goal with this mean high water project is really just to provide a clearinghouse of data, not only to links of maps like this that I've created, but other resources that are out there. Blair Holloway with the National Weather Service maintains this coastal flood event database for both Charleston and Savannah. It's a great clearinghouse of records of the flood tides that we've seen. Most of the stats that I've referenced in this presentation are from that. I've linked this on the website. The city has developed a Tie-Dye app, which is a GIS dashboard that I've actually made a shortcut on my home screen, on my cell phone, so that when we're experiencing tidal events, I can pull it up. It not only shows what the tides are and what the weather conditions are and what they're predicted to be, you can click on the little stoplight at the bottom and it pulls up city-reported gross closures and even pulls in data from apps like Waze. So you can actually use this to get a real-life understanding of how these floods are impacting our streets and our roads. And I've referenced a lot of other data on there, and I'd like to grow that resource. So if there's any data or any resources that you have, I'd love to hear about them and include them on this website. And my final fourth goal, and probably the most important goal of the website, and probably what I've done the least of, is I want to use this as a tool to collaborate. Some of my most meaningful professional and personal accomplishments have occurred when I coordinate with other people that aren't engineers, when I get out in the community and work with people from different educations, social, political backgrounds, because that's really where the cross-pollination and innovation occur. And we're not going to build community resilience if we don't do projects like this and collaborate. There's a lot of infrastructure talk, a lot of money that's going to need to be invested and invested wisely. But I don't think there's a moonshot project that's going to make us more resilient to flooding that we can just build and buy. We have to work together and build community resilience, like Cyrus was talking about, to really understand and start having meaningful impact to make our communities resilient. And just a few examples of things that I've worked with Dr. Mary Coster, who's here in the audience, her STEAM project, Kids Teaching Flood Resilience. She's really challenged me to break down a lot of the data that I deal with every day and she's teaching kids, elementary through high school, and empowering them with the knowledge to understand how the tides work, how the moon cycles work, and really letting them make decisions for themselves on what makes them and their families more resilient. That's community resilience. I also got to collaborate with Spencer George, who grew up in Charleston, who's a freelance journalist and author on this piece for the Bitter Southerner, getting the word out about how the creative community in Charleston is responding to climate change. And just this week, Mary sent me a picture tonight. The Circular Church is doing a Blue Line project where they have put lines of where Hurricane Hugo got on their property, where Hurricane Hugo would get on their property today with sea level rise that we've seen from '89, and where Hurricane Hugo would get with sea level rise predicted in 2100. These are real-life exhibits that you can walk through and see actually see the risk we have and what we're experiencing and really understand what we're up against. And with that, thank you.